Chapter 8. The prison system, inherently unjust and inhumane, is the ultimate expression of injustice and inhumanity in the society at large. Those of us on the outside do not like to think of wardens and guards as our surrogates. Yet they are, and they are intimately locked in a deadly embrace with their human captives beyond the prison walls. By extension, so are we. A terrible double meaning is thus imparted to the original question of human ethics. Am I my brother's keeper? When I came in, the penitentiary of New Mexico was only 6 years old. It had been built because the situation at the old prison had become so explosive the legislature could no longer avoid the issue. Brick and mortar do not a change make, however. The same conditions that forced the closing of the old facility continues. All the state had bought itself was a newer, larger animal house. The situation had been intolerable for 5 years before the legislature even decided to investigate the old institution, no less make any changes. It's the same old problem that has existed since the beginning of penal institutions. The public doesn't want to know about them. They don't want to think about what makes a human being become a so-called criminal any more than they want to know about how he's treated once he's been arrested. They're content to hide him away in a remote fortress, out of sight, out of mind. But America is finding out that this old adage no longer holds true when it comes to the treatment of its criminal element. People are discovering that it's the penitentiaries themselves that are keeping the crime rate up. Most convicts are going to be back on the streets after they've served their sentences. And as things are, they're going to be filled with the hate and rage prison life incites. The fact is, U.S. prisons are not only hate factories, they're crime factories. But as long as John Q. Public refuses to look the problem in the eye, neither will the senators and the representatives who could initiate change. It is proven true, at least to convicts, that legislatures act only when inmates take the matter into their own hands and cause a disturbance big enough to attract the public's attention. In the mind of a convict, a riot is a legitimate means of communication. In December 1948, the residents of the old penitentiary of New Mexico rioted in a protest over the bad food and the steward in charge of cooking it. 6 months later, a fight between two prisoners stirred other inmates to express their frustrations in a violent disturbance in the prison yard. In November 1950, another riot erupted over a feud between prisoners and guards, as the Legislative Committee report gently termed it, though a number of guards were injured. There was an unsuccessful escape attempt in June 1952 that caused a guard to be killed and the warden to resign. 6 months hence, there was another escape attempt, with the escapees forcing open a vault and confiscating the guns stored inside it. These convicts were subdued before they could get away or use the weapons. But tensions in the prisons didn't ease up. The next month, there was a fight between rival gangs that left one inmate stabbed to death and several others wounded. Even after these 4 years of chronic violent eruptions, New Mexico's legislature didn't take immediate action. It took yet another uprising by inmates to make the public insist that their government representatives do something about the penitentiary. Crime is a politically dangerous subject, so politicians don't usually take a stand on it until their constituency pushes them to do so. Former Governor Jerry Apodaca summed this up in explaining why his efforts to reform the penitentiary failed. Who cares about the penitentiary? Inmates? Well, how many are there? 1,200? Maybe 1,300 at the highest? They can't even vote. They're a very small constituency. Sure, they have families, they have friends, but sometimes the local pressures from society are much greater. In 1953, the legislature at last assigned a committee to investigate the causes of violence in the state's prison. The expert they brought in to head this inquiry was Douglas C. Rigg, former assistant warden at San Quentin. Rigg reported the institution's problems on factors that have existed in prisons since their inception and continue to exist in these enlightened times. An inadequate system of classifying inmates for placement and security, idleness, lack of education and recreation, insufficient medical services, untrained and underpaid guards, and little dissemination of information to the press and public. Rigg told the legislative committee that the incidents of violence are usually symptoms and not causes of bad conditions. The conditions outlined in my report took years to develop. I believe my recommendations will help improve them. In the last analysis, the prison conditions are the responsibility of the legislature, which expresses the will of the people. The will of the people of New Mexico was to apply brick and mortar to the situation, plus a dollop of good intentions to pave the road for the future. The new penitentiary of New Mexico, 24 years later, to become site of the most savage prison riot in America's history, opened on April 20th, 1956, with the usual ribbon-cutting ceremony and public relations hype. Touting it as a model of humane corrections, the state handed out a press release listing 50 brief facts and figures about the institution, citing the 1 million gallons of water the pumps could move each day, the 132,000 bags of cement used to construct the facility, and the 24,000 spent on the gas chamber. The release ended with a brief statement of political rhetoric. Walls and bars make a prison, but they don't change men for the better. Our objective through group and individual training is to try to discharge these men to the free community as law-abiding, responsible citizens who can and will support themselves and their dependents. But by 1958, Warden H.R. Swenson was reporting to the legislature that the major problem facing the penitentiary now is prisoner idleness. If all the jobs were counted up, there would be work for about 300 men. Although New Mexico has one of the finest penal institutions in the country, it could be destroyed in a year if the men are not kept occupied. As well, and as usual, there was the problem of prison personnel. Of greatest importance, it is the selection, training, and proper utilization of personnel, Warden Swenson said. The old concept of the officer who is only a guard is giving way to the recognition that he is actually a supervisor and as such has responsibilities requiring qualifications, training, and compensation beyond those required for purely security work. Again, however, the politicians didn't listen. It was only an opinion, and their constituents didn't seem to share or care about it. The legislature was willing to provide money for literally concrete changes, but not for the people inside the concrete, not in terms of rehabilitation programs or in raises for corrections officers. In 1956, a guard's starting salary was $265 a month. A stenographer in secretarial pool was making as much. This was, of course, not enough money to attract a man with intelligence, sensitivity, and education to the dangerous field of overseeing caged criminals. Studies bear this out. They show that only 1 out of 2 guards in the nation's prisons is even a high school graduate, and only 1 out of 3 has been to college, not graduated either, just attended. A Rhode Island college professor named Alan Berman did a survey of 100 applicants for jobs in the state's prisons and found that most of them showed emotional shallowness, alienation from social norms, and relative inability to profit from social sanctions. The University of Rhode Island's psychology department also tested correctional officer applicants against prison inmates to see the violence potential of each. The test showed the two groups were almost identical, with the guards coming out more violent than the inmates. Imagine that. The officer group actually has the potential for even more unexplained lashing out than does the group of inmates. The officer candidates are as likely as the inmates to engage in assaultive behavior. In congressional hearings, too, evidence has piled up to prove that the occupation of correctional officer appeals to those who like to wield power over the powerless and to persons of sadistic bent. For the ridiculous wages paid, even in 1980, the starting salary for a guard at the penitentiary of New Mexico was a lowly $765 a month. It's understandable that the only reason a man would take the job would be out of desperation or hate. Hate is just a short jump away from the judgmental, holier-than-thou attitude that formed the concept of the American penitentiary. In 1787, Philadelphian Dr. Benjamin Rush walked into good old Benjamin Franklin's home and proposed that the right way to treat offenders was to make them repent their crimes. Offenders should be locked alone in cells day and night, so that in such awful solitude they would have nothing to do but to ponder their acts, repent, and reform. From Dr. Rush's ideas evolved the Auburn system, the model for the penitentiary of today. That system added a sadistic twist to Dr. Rush's original notion. Elam Lins, the first warden of Sing Sing, which was built in 1825, summed up the philosophy that has guided the thinking of corrections officials in this country for the past 150 years. Reformation of the criminal could not be possible or effective until the spirit of the criminal was broken. Quite the opposite has proven to be the case. If there's been any reformation at all from the prison experience, it's been to turn petty thieves into killers and lifetime residents of the nation's penitentiaries. Reformation. Ask any warden or guard or prisoner administrator what he thinks about the possibilities of reformation or what his true opinion of a convict is. If you catch him in a rare moment of honesty, he'll tell you that he sees the inmate as something less than a human and punishment as the only thing that works to keep him in line. The law itself upholds this view. When a person is convicted of committing a felony, he forfeits all individual rights. He is in a state of civil death. He has, as a consequence of his crime, not only forfeited his liberty, but all his personal rights except those which the law in its humanity accords to him. He is for the time being the slave of the state. The courts have interpreted the 13th Amendment as it applies to lawbreakers this way. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. Because the law of the land holds that a convict is in this state of civil death, the courts likewise uphold the anatomy of the prison administrators in running this country's penal institutions. They have ruled that courts are without power to supervise prison administration or to interfere with the ordinary prison rules or regulations. Once the gates of the animal farm close around a person convicted of committing a crime, he answers only to the law of the poorly paid, emotionally shallow, alienated, potentially violent, sadistic men who, studies have shown, flock to the field of corrections. Maybe the old way of treating criminals before the penitentiary system was instituted is more humane. Certainly, it more honestly reflected the attitude of society toward those who broke its laws. If you committed a crime in the early days of America, you were going to feel the revenge of citizenry.